Hello everyone, my name is Stonesy Boy and welcome back to Reading with Stonesy. A little bit later in the day, meaning most likely going to be some edits or some so, just FYI, if audio sounds a bit jumbly. But yeah, 15 pages, shouldn't be that long, and we are on, well, let's start. We are on Chapter 6, Into the Sea of Sorrows. A brief moment in a better place, journeying past forlorn shores, a howling of terrible things, a nasty farewell. Stack sat on the dock of the boathouse, eating a piece of cake, looking out over the water. A fish jumped a few blocks out of the railing, and Cole twitched her ears sleepily. Then decided whatever disturbed her wasn't worth waking up for. Stax had baked the cake in one of the house's furnaces. After looking up his mother's recipe, he wasn't sure she would approve the cake for breakfast, but it was good, moist, sweet, and delicious. Though he hadn't quite made the recipe quite correctly, it seemed beneath the sweetness there was something gritty and unpleasant in the cake. He could feel it crunching between his back teeth, almost like it was sand. Stax woke up in a start and heard himself cry out. A red-haired woman wearing one of his grandmother's flower pots as a helmet gaped at him and let out a shriek, then waved her hands in mock fright and laughed. Stax stared at her in befuddlement, and a moment before it all came back, the raid on his house, his kidnapping, the grueling journey across the sea as a prisoner. He was sitting up on a grimy bed on a gray, stony beach, next to a dying fire, and there was the sand in his mouth. In the boat on 2 minutes, or I'll tie your hands again, Mig said, kicking sand in Stax's direction. Stax turned his head so he didn't get sand in his eyes, then spat out as much of the grit in his mouth as he could. He supposed Mig's offer was passed for kindness for the Raiders' world, and he wasn't going to pass it up, not when his wrists were still red and painfully raw. He pulled on his boots and waded out of the boat, where Miggs acknowledged him in a reluctant grunt. "Gonna be a hard day today," Miggs said, "and maybe tomorrow too. We'll be passing dangerous coasts. You give me any trouble, fancy boy, and we'll see how you can swim." "It is true. We're going into the Sea of Sorrows," Kavak asked Miggs, and Stax, the swallow-faced raider, looked frightened. "We'll go where the boss tells us to go," Miggs said sharply. "No need to put names on where. You know he don't like that. Just shut your mouth and row." Stax kept his eyes down, trying to avoid incurring the Raider's wrath. But he repeated the name Kavak had said in his head over and over until he was sure he wouldn't forget it. Sea of Sorrows, Sea of Sorrows, Sea of Sorrows. The boats moved out, and hours of everything looked much the same as it did the previous day. Water as far as the eye could see, with the boats feeling tiny and vulnerable in the midst of all the emptiness. On the day, however, there was barely a cloud in the sky, and the sun was high and bright, a brilliant white coin in the dark blue sky. Miggs and Kavak were sweating freely behind the oars, grunting as they worked side by side in their boats. After a time, Stax spotted islands to their left, shimmering in the sunlight, low bits of land covered in the trees. Then, there were islands on their right as well, a chain of rocks rising out of the water. An hour later, the line of islands to their right rose from the sea, to become a brooding headland of gray rock. At Fueg's command, the boats angled in close in the rugged coast, close enough that Stax could hear the surf on the beach and the tumble and shush of the water withdrawing and dragging thousands of pebbles into the waves. Kavak began to mother nervously, constantly looking over at the rocks, and Mig's eyes were wide and white in his tanned face. "They'll come," Kavak said nervously. "Drown will come and take us below, like so many before us." "Them tall tales," Mig said, but Stax could hear the fear in his voice. "Stories to frighten little ones." "What stories?" Stax told Kavak. Asked Kavak, vaguely remembering that Fueg had mentioned the drowned. "What is this place? And where are the drowned?" "Zombies," Kavak said. "Cursed men and women who died at sea. They say these waters is full of them, on account of the wrecks. They might say at night you can see the moonlight glittering in their tridents. Only if you do, it's too late for you, because the drowned throw those things hard enough to pierce stone, and they return to the dead hand what they threw them." "No, another word, Kavak," said Miggs, "or I'll throw you over the side and let you meet one of them." Kavak subsided into muttering, but Stax was staring at the bleak shore, thinking that every gleam and bit of reflection amid the rocks was a weapon in hand of the undead warrior. Stax had spotted no signs of life on the journey, no villages, farms, or houses. But now he began to see buildings on the cliffs above them, but all of them were abandoned and forlorn, towers reduced to tumbles and spikes, the burned-out shells of houses, overgrown fields, and fallen fences. "What a dreary place," Stax said. As if in response, a raider in the line of boats ahead of them turned out to call out a warning, their partner waving a torch to get their attention. "Head to port, Kavak," Miggs growled. "That's your left." As Kavak grumbled as he'd known that since he was a lad, Stax spotted the obstacle ahead, a ship, or at least what was left of one, jammed against the rocks. Much of its upper deck had been smashed apart, its masts were gone, and the rock had opened a gash in its bow. "Don't look, row," Miggs told Kavak. But Stax had no such duties. Filled with dread, he tried to peer through the jagged rents of the wreck's hull, expecting to see some waterlogged corpse, waiting with a trident in his hand, but no enemy worked within, and there was no sound except the splash of oars. They continued along that lonely shore for hours, passing more shattered towers and broken ships, until Stax had grown numb from the sight of masts sticking out of the waves and odd angles and holes reduced to clumps of planks. The boat ahead had slowed, and its rowers wait for Miggs and Kavak to pull alongside. "The boss says keep going," said the white-haired raider with a tattoo tears on her cheeks. "We row through the night." Kavak started to mutter, but Miggs just nodded as the boat pulled away again, and then he began to row, hard, his muscled arms shooting the boat through the water. The sun sank in the sky, and the night crept over the water, a night that Saxon would never remember forever. The moon rose as the sun disappeared. It cast a ghostly white residence over the ruins on the shore, and the wrecked ships along it, as well as the things that came out of the forest and up from the swamps to prowl up at night. Stax could see them all too well, and they could see them too. Skeletons stood sentinel among the rocks, their bony hands clutching bows, and Stax could hear a hiss of arrows in the air around them. Green-skinned zombies plotted across the beach, the groans carrying through the night, wet and thick in horrible desire. Stax spotted green pillars of creepers, their back mouths fixed with silent screams, and there were things he thought only glimpses of eyes, like red lamps, or ones like purple slits, enviously tracking the boats as they passed. Kavak had let off muttering as loudly beseeching every god he'd ever heard before of mercy. But though panicked to find himself so close to such a demon of the night, he kept rowing, his knuckles white on the oars. Miggs was silent, his eyes fixed straight ahead, as if he thought refusing to look at something meant it could hurt him. Stax had neither oar nor weapon, and couldn't defend himself or help row them out of trouble. He could only sit there, terrified, wondering when one of those arrows could find its target, or a trident would come through the boat and spear them. Dead hands could rise up from the water and drag them beneath the waves. It wasn't until nearly dawn that he fell into a doze, and even when his dreams were spiked with jolts of panic, the crews were all exhausted, slumped numbly over the oars, but Voyage refused to call a halt. So they rowed on for hours and hours. Grim and silent, beneath leading gray skies that seemed to constantly threaten rain. It finally began to drizzle as the day neared its end. With the sun and red smear in the clouds began them. The drizzle slowly intensified until Miggs was struggling to see the shore and wiping water away from his face. "What does the boss mean to do? Sail on until we fall off the edge of the world?" Kavak wailed in the next boat. "Keep your eyes open," Miggs growled, "or we will come next to a bad long before then." It grew harder and harder to see, and Stax sagged in relief when the word came that Voyage had finally agreed to make camp in the little bay up ahead. The bay was sheltered, but Kavak began muttering as soon as he saw it. It was bleak and sandy, a little more than a low, swampy stretch carpeted with brambles and scrub. Below sandy hills, the neo wrecked ship was visible above the water just offshore, and in the center of the bay stood the stump of a tower of gray stone, surrounded by assembled rock blocks overgrown with moss. "That's an unlucky shore, sure as I'm a sailor," Kavak muttered, and Miggs had to shout at him to bring his boats into the shallows, where the rest of the raiders were unloading their gear and Stax stolen property trying to build a fire. Stax stumbled when he got off the boat, his legs stiff and cramped. Miggs was too exhausted to pay attention as he trudged up the beach to warm himself by the fire. Voyage was barking orders, his face grim, but forced a smile onto his face when he saw Stax. "I think we've found your new home, Stax," he said. "It even comes with a house. Not quite as fancy as you're used to, but it's a fixer-upper." Stax looked around in a grim swamp with alarm. While he huddled at Miggs's feet, he would have said he'd take his chances ashore, or anywhere besides the boat, but now that idea seemed insane. And there was something else, a nameless dread he could feel, like a chill, crawling up the back of his neck. You know how sometimes you can feel someone looking at you, even if you couldn't say how you know? That's something like that Stax felt. Only, he also felt that whenever he was watching is simultaneously hungry and patient, willing to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike. There was something wrong here, something terribly wrong. And though he was neither a warrior nor an explorer, he could feel it. And he wasn't the only one. As he sat slumped on a chunk of stone, Stax could see the way the raiders hurried up the beach after unloading the boat, and the fear in their faces when they looked out in the water. He could see the way that she shied from the shattered stones of the tower, and peered suspiciously at the wreck in the shallows. Voyage was looking around too, his gaze roving ceaselessly from the water on the top of the hills. None of the raiders was paying attention to Stax. For a moment, he thought of slipping up the beach, seeing if anyone noticed. If they hadn't, perhaps he could keep going and make it over the top of the hill. And then he'd have a chance to hide or run. He dreamed of a chance to like that many times in the boat, trying to figure out just how quickly he'd be able to flee, and that he might be able to makeshift weapon. But now that he actually had the chance, he felt frozen in place. Just as he knew something terrible was watching them from the water, he also knew that even greater danger away from the raiders than he was with them. Mick stood at Foy's side, speaking to them in a low, urgent voice, but the raider boss shook his head. "Just get the fire built and everyone will feel better," Foy said. "And tomorrow will bring clear skies, you'll see." Mick tried to say something else, but Foy held his arms over his chest. "Every shore in this world is a dangerous shore," he said. "But I thought you were dangerous men and women. Was I wrong about that? If anything comes out of the sea, that will be the last mistake. Now, enough, Miggs. Get the fire built." Miggs nodded and turned away, and for a moment Stax could see the disgust in one big bearded man's face. And then he was barking orders, with the others heard in turn of action. That night there was neither singing nor jokes. Foy's raiders were exhausted and clearly nervous. But the fire started to blaze up as the first stars came out, and a few minutes later, the sun reduced his light shone on the horizon. Stax smelled meat roasting, and for a moment, just a moment, he thought the danger had passed. That was when Kavak died. The sallow-faced man was coming back from the campfire, gnawing on a chunk of mutton spitted on a fork. When he stopped in his track, a confused expression came over his face. He was standing right in front of Stax, and at first Stax assumed Kavak was about to mock him or something. But then Stax heard a sound he could never forget, a wet gurgling groan, coming from the beach. Kavak slumped over, an oddly disappointed look on his face. It was the last breath he made was a wet sound so similar to a groan coming from the dark beach that Stax shivered. Then he plopped into the sand. "Drown!" screeched the raider, her eyes wild. "The drowned have come for us." Stax looked out into the beach and saw a grey-green figure cladding the sodden rags, a trident clutched in its hand. The drowned lurched forward out of the sea, its feet squishing in the wet sand. His skin was molted and drab, and his eyes were bright green, shining in eerie light. It groaned again, and water bubbled out of his throat, ran down the front of his ruined shirt. An arrow flew into the night, a wild shot but missed, and the raiders fell back, yelling. Then Mick stepped forward, his sword in an orange blur in the campfire. The drowned slumped to the sand, and Mick turned to look at for Fueg. "It's only sunset," he said. "Soon there will be more, boss. Many more. We can't stay here." Fueg looked uncertain for a moment, then nodded. Mick started yelling out orders. The goods had been unloaded from the boats were loaded nearly as quickly, and several reluctant raiders pressed into forming a defensive line at the water's edge, swords heeled in front of them. "Stax, I'm afraid our association has come to an end," Fueg said with a little bow. "Here's where we part. But don't forget the gift I've given you." "Gift?" Stax asked, too shocked and frightened to be angry. "What are you talking about?" "Why, the greatest gift of all, Stax. I freed you from your past. Now you can be anything you want to be. You can experience the world and make something of yourself, instead of idling away your days amid the accomplishments of others. Or I suppose you can give up and die here. It's your choice." Something groaned wetly in the gloom on the other side of the ruined tower. "Still, I'd choose quickly," Fueg said. "Very well, Mr. Stonecutter." The first raiders had leapt into their boats and rowed away from the shore. Now the others followed. Fueg was the last to depart, offering Stax a little wave as he stepped into the stern of his boat. Within moments the boats were pale dots against the dark water, and a moment after that they were lost to sight. Stax stood alone on the shore, next to the campfire. It began to rain harder. The fire hissed and spat, fighting a losing battle against the water. Stax sat down in the sand next to it, his arms around his knees, as the rain pelted down and the last bit of sunlight vanished below the horizon. Chapter 7. Cornered. A fight in the night. Searching for refuge. Stax digs in a beautiful morning. Stax wonders what's possible. Stax knew he needed to run or fight or do both, but he found that he couldn't get further thinking about it. Fight? He couldn't even imagine being able to get out of the rain. He thought of the dream of home another morning, before he awakened in the raiders' last camp, and tried to convince himself it was a dream too. Perhaps he could wake up in his sunny bedroom, find the cats reminding him that time of breakfast, and realize Voyage Temporal had been a vivid nightmare, one that would soon fade a vaguely pleasant memory. But Stax knew that wasn't true, and all his wishing in the overworld wouldn't make it true. He knew that even before he heard something heavy squelching through the sand, and a growl from the other side of the campfire. He looked up, trying desperately to blink away the rainwater as raining into his eyes, and saw a dark shape there, something sharp, shaped like a man, but it wasn't human anymore. Lightning split in the sky, and he stared into the empty green eyes of a drowned, the flash of light revealing its terrible features in minute detail, green flash so heavy that it dragged down the corner of its mouth. Swollen fingers like hideous sausages, and black, jagged fingernails. The drowned saw him too. It gurgled so eagerly in the flight of tiny bubbles popped around his lips. Dark water ran down his chin. Then, as the thunder boomed overhead, its arms came up and started to stagger toward him. Stax sat there, frozen in horror, and then as he jumped up, another sudden groan. This one was behind him, close enough that he could hear water bubbling in its throat. Before he was conscious of it, he had scrambled away from the fire. And at the last possible second, the drowned had snuck up behind him and took a huge swipe at Stax. But unfortunately, connected only with air. Meanwhile, the first drowned had found its way around the campfire and stood side by side with its fellow undead, eyes fixed on its prey. Stax leapt to his feet, eyes wide, and screamed at them. "Come on then, what are you waiting for?" The drowned trudged through the sand, their hands reaching for him. Stax ducked, and then backpedaled frantically, his feet struggling for purchase. Another flash of lightning revealed something glimmering in the gloom. A trident, clutched by a third drowned, who was still waist deep in the water. "Oh no," Stax said. He was worried about the weapon and failed to look behind him, and backed into something soft, squishy, and cold. A terrible smell filled his nostrils, stagnant water, and beneath that something rotten. A drowned had bent into groan, and the water coughed up ran down the back of Stax's neck, making him shiver as the creature fumbled to smash him with his fist. Stax twisted away from the dead thing and shoved it, wincing as his hand sank into the spongy flesh. His fist beat at the drowned while it swung wildly at him. Then the drowned fell backward in the bubbling sigh. Stax staggered further up the beach, breathing hard. Something flashed past his ear. It was a trident, and it nearly hit him. Stax followed its pale purple arc through the darkness as it returned to its order's hand, guiding it by some dreadful magic. A flow from the first of another drowned caught him in the back, and he stumbled forward, crying out. "This is the end. I don't think of something," Stax thought. He was faster than the drowned, but there was too many of them. As if he stood his ground, he would eventually batter him to unconsciousness, or the trident would find his mark. And then he would die, or become one of them, doomed to live out eternity in his bleak shore, consumed by rage and hunger that could never be satisfied. He ran between two of the shambling figures, certain that any second he'd feel the trident strike home, and scrambled up the sandy hill, repeatedly falling to his hands and knees. He reached to the top of just as lightning flashed, revealing barren desert as far as he could see. There was no escape that way. Stax flung himself down the other side of the hill, hearing the drowned gurgling confusion at the side of him. Halfway down he began to dig, his hands moving frantically. In a moment he was going the layer of wet sand on the surface and flinging dry grit behind him. Frantically trying to make a hole, he was digging even deeper. Thunder rumbled. As it faded, he could hear the drowned's groans in frustration. Stax kept digging, ignoring his stinging fingers and palms. He hollowed out a low space in the hill now, just big enough to turn around in. He clambered into it and was relieved to find sandstone above him, hard and stable. Stax began to dig down now, further down the hill. He chopped after a couple of frantic minutes, grasping for breath. He could see the night sky above him. Outside was a vulnerable refuge, and the wall of rain falling. He could keep digging until he was certain he was out of reach of any arms that might come through the gap he left. Should he fill it in, pack it sand until he was walked inside of the hill? Stax knew he probably should, but there'd be nowhere to hide if the trident's owner found him. But the idea of escaping the drowned only suffocated and sand filled him with horror, and he was exhausted, bone-tired, in the way that he'd never been in his entire life. Stax huddled in the hole as he made, shivering until he'd recovered enough the breathing slowed and his heart stopped pounding in his ears. His fingertips were raw from scrabbling at the sand, and his palms were red and scraped. Outside, the rain continued to pelt down, and he could still hear the thunder rolling and the groans of the drowned searching for the beach. Stax was sure that at any moment he'd hear the low, slow-labored steps of the undead feet outside his refuge, followed by the choking gurgle of triumph and his hands working, slowly but methodically, to strip away his meager defenses. But a minute passed and that didn't happen, and then 5 minutes, and then Stax lost track of how much time had passed. And then he was blinking his eyes in confusion, because bright light was streaming through the gap of the sand. It had become a strip of blue above him, the color of the sky at morning. Whizzing at the pain in his hand, Stax carefully pushed enough sand out of the way to be able to stick his head out of the refuge. Yellow sand stretched out around him. Below him was a strip of green and ruined towered, and the blurred blue water beyond that. The drowned were gone. Stax shoved his way through the sand and trudged down the beach, trying to shake the grit out of his hair. Here and there in the sand were bits of loot raiders had left behind in their haste to escape. There wasn't a weapon to be found, but Stax did spot a bruised apple he fell on frantically, eating it in core and all. He also found a few lumps of coal he had burned for fuel, and best of all, he discovered an abandoned bed at the edge of the water, wet and salty but intact. He had survived the night, but now what? It wouldn't be night again soon, and he had no boat for refuge. There wasn't so much as a tree. Stax dragged the bed up to the beach to dry. He looked at the wrecked tower, eyed the hull of the shipwreck in the shallows of the bay, then turned his gaze to the horizon, hoping to spot a more hospitable island and the islet so he could swim to. Then he looked back at the pale keel and the wreckage boat, lying above the water. That's made of wood, he thought. A lot of wood. His eyes returned to the four-loomed spike of the tower, scrutinizing it in the way he might examine a tumbled rock and he encountered in the cavern far beneath the ground. He thought about the condition of the stone he could see, and measured the gaps in the tower's walls. I bet I could repair that. And that's that. So, next time, it'll be page 63. Yeah, we had a few, even though it's edited out, we had a few problems. 63 to 80. Wait, is that just 80 straight up? 78. Okay, if it's not 78, what is it? 80. It's either that or 90. So I guess it's 78. The next time is 70. Okay, so then it's 70. Or it's not 78, it's 77. 77, so 63 to 77. Which is 14 pages. By math, next time should be 13 pages. But, I don't know, is it? 70, 80, 90? Is the next page 90? Huh, it is. And then the next one would be 11, so 90 to 101. Let's go to page 101. Nope, it's not to page 101. It'd be... Wait, why would I stop? Because that's technically 80, right? So it'd be 77 to... Oh, I guess it... 77 to 100 or 77 to... Be 77 to... Or 78 to... 101. Which... Or 78 to 101, which would be... Two... Hold on. 280... 22. So yeah. Episode after this one's going to be kind of long, but for right now, it's been pretty short. Short. So yep, I hope you guys have a super fantastic, wonderful day. People like, be efficient, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.